They were not designed for conquest. They were not designed for patrol. They were designed as a statement, the final, unambiguous answer to anyone who might one day look at Earth and see an opportunity. And now, after centuries of silence, the statement was ready to be read. In a quiet command room somewhere near Earth's orbit, Commander Elara Voss stood before a wall of screens and watched the galaxy react. She was a small woman with gray in her hair and a stillness about her that newer officers often mistook for coldness. It was not coldness. It was a particular calm of someone who had spent 30 years preparing for a moment and had long since made peace with what it meant. She watched the alien fleets beginning to mobilize on the long-range displays. Cruisers, battle carriers, command ships, gathering at the edges of human space, like storm clouds building on a horizon. She did not smile. "Phase 1 is complete," she said softly. And across human space, ancient machines opened their eyes. The Galactic Council's ultimatum arrived within the week, broadcast on every human channel simultaneously, translated into 47 languages, and framed with the kind of authority that had made lesser species collapse into apology. Humanity, unauthorized power structures of a legal scale, have been detected within your space. You will surrender control of these objects immediately and submit to Council inspection. Failure to comply within 72 standard hours will be interpreted as an act of aggression and will result in military occupation. It was, by galactic standards, a generous warning. Most civilizations received far less. Humanity sent no reply, not a denial, not an explanation, not a plea. The human channels remained exactly as they had always been, calm, sparse, and apparently untroubled. Trade communications continued. Scientific papers were still published. A minor dispute over water rights on a colony moon was reported and resolved. It was as if the ultimatum had simply failed to arrive. In the council chamber, this silence was processed as fear. Species that had been afraid before knew how to hide it in busyness, filling the air with noise so no one could hear the trembling underneath. The Sheth ambassador suggested the humans were stalling, buying time to dismantle whatever half-functional ancient device they had stumbled upon and accidentally activated. Others agreed. The confidence that had shattered at the first signal quietly rebuilt itself, brick by comfortable brick. A forward fleet was dispatched, not a full armada. That would have been excessive, and there were political calculations to consider. Just enough force to make the point clearly. 300 warships under Admiral Serath of the Drenai Collective, a commander with 40 years of experience and a reputation for surgical efficiency. He had pacified 6 worlds in his career. He expected this assignment to be simpler than most. He was wrong in a way that would change him permanently. The fleet crossed into the outer system on a clear trajectory, sensors sweeping ahead, all systems reading nominal. Admiral Serath stood on the bridge of his flagship, hands clasped behind his back, studying the data feeds with the practiced eye of a man who had seen a great many things and been surprised by very few of them. Then the readings began to drift, subtly at first. Signal delays that fell just outside the margin of error, distance calculations that didn't quite agree with each other, navigation points that seemed to shift between measurements. Serath's sensor officer flagged the anomalies and was told to recalibrate. She recalibrated. The anomalies remained. Minor interference. Serath said, "Proceed." Then the stars moved, not violently, not all at once. It was gradual, the way shadows shift when a cloud passes overhead, a slow, enormous rearrangement of the darkness. Something that had been invisible became visible in the way that the largest things always do. Not by appearing, but by making you realize you had already been looking at it, without understanding what you were seeing. It revealed itself in pieces. A curve of hull darker than the space behind it. A surface so vast it had its own geometry. A shape that the mind resisted, because the mind was not built to hold scales like this comfortably. The fleet slowed without being ordered. 300 ships, veterans of a dozen campaigns, slowing down not because their commanders told them to, but because some ancient, wordless part of them recognized what they were facing and applied the only response that has ever made biological sense. Data flooded in. Size estimates climbed and kept climbing until the systems quietly stopped calculating, having reached the limits of what their designers had thought necessary to measure. That is not debris, whispered Sarah to the second officer. No one contradicted her. The warship did not power weapons. It did not charge toward them. It did not broadcast threats or demands. It simply waited, occupying space with the patience of something that had been patient for a very long time and had no reason to stop. And then Commander Voss, watching from a room near Earth, gave a single quiet word. The warship began to move. It advanced the way mountains advance in geological time, with a slowness that somehow made it more terrifying rather than less. Even at a fraction of its potential speed, the physics around it bent and groaned. Gravity fields rippled outward like a stone dropped into still water, invisible but measurable, reaching the fleet's outer ships and pulling them slightly, irresistibly off course. "Adjust formation," Sareth ordered, his voice still controlled, still professional. A commander holds his voice steady even when the floor is falling away beneath him. The order came too late. A wave of energy, not an explosion, not a beam, but a field, an expanding pressure of force and geometry, swept through the fleet. Shields flickered. Power grids stuttered. 3 smaller vessels lost propulsion entirely and began to tumble, their crews fighting helplessly with systems that had simply forgotten how to work. "This is impossible," someone on the bridge said. "No structure should generate gravitational distortion at this level. The energy requirements alone would." Space went dark. Not dimmed, not shadowed. Dark. The stars behind the warship vanished, swallowed into a veil that sensors could not penetrate and eyes could not explain. The fleet was left illuminated by their own running lights, alone in a pocket of manufactured night, while something incomprehensibly vast sat before them and demonstrated, with infinite patience, the difference between what the galaxy thought it knew and what was actually true. On the bridge of the flagship, Admiral Sareth stood very still. He had faced death before. He had faced desperation and impossible odds, and a particular fear that comes with command, when your choices determine whether others live or die. He thought he knew what fear felt like. He understood now that he had only known its smaller relatives. This was not a weapon designed for battle. A weapon designed for battle wanted to win. This wanted something else, something quieter and more permanent. It wanted the people looking at it to understand, in the deepest part of themselves, that the conversation about whether humanity could be challenged had already ended. They simply hadn't been informed yet. Far away, in the human command center, no one celebrated. Officers watched their screens with expressions not of triumph, but of something older and sadder. The expression of people who had always known this day would come and had never truly wanted it to. A second shadow appeared on alien sensors. Then a third. "Inform the galaxy," Commander Voss said quietly. "Tell them this was a warning." And the warships opened their final systems, and the galaxy saw a power it had never imagined existed, and it did not look away, because it could not. The recording traveled faster than the ships turning to flee. Emergency signals cascaded through every major system. Trade routes locked down. Military commands froze mid-order, waiting for context that would not help them when it arrived. On hundreds of worlds, leaders gathered around displays showing the same footage. Planet-sized human warships drifting through space like ancient gods returning from somewhere older than memory, bending the fabric of reality simply by being present, utterly unhurried, utterly certain. The Galactic Council reconvened in a chamber that had never felt so small. The arguments were immediate and irreconcilable. Surrender. Negotiate. Strike first. Evacuate. The projections were run in real time by a dozen different analytical systems, and every single one reached the same conclusion through different paths. Humanity had not built a fleet. They had built an answer. And the question, the one the galaxy had been asking of young civilizations since before recorded history, had finally been answered in a way that left no room for a follow-up. When Earth's message arrived, it required no translation. It was short enough to be read in a single breath. "We prepared because the galaxy never stops testing new worlds. We will not be tested again." In the silence that followed, alien historians began the frantic work of reassessment. They pulled centuries of human records, looking for the seams in the story, trying to find where the deception had begun. They found sealed research zones and archives that had seemed routine, budget allocations with benign labels that, in retrospect, pointed somewhere far larger than their description suggested. Colony settlements that had been reported as abandoned, whose coordinates, when charted against the warships' revealed positions, told a very different story. Humanity had not hidden. They had simply allowed the galaxy to see what it expected to see, and the galaxy, comfortable, confident, and thoroughly underestimating a species it had never taken the time to understand, had been grateful for permission. More warships revealed themselves. They rose from dark orbits and deep space shadows like a tide coming in, slow and inevitable. Not hundreds, not thousands. Enough that the arithmetic was obvious to anyone willing to do it. Enemy fleets powered down their weapons. Some turned and left without a word. Others simply drifted, waiting for orders that their commanders were no longer capable of giving. And Earth sent no demands, rewrote no borders, claimed no territories, asked for no tribute or submission or acknowledgement of debt. They asked for one thing only, in the oldest currency that any civilization truly understands: respect. For 3 days, the galaxy processed what had happened. Alliances shifted. Old threats that had hung over smaller civilizations for decades quietly evaporated. There were worlds that had been paying tribute to empires for generations who suddenly found their benefactors unwilling to make eye contact. And then the last fleet arrived. They were the Vorath, a warrior civilization with a history stretching back for 1,000 years, whose identity was so completely bound up with their military dominance that surrender to them was not a tactical option, but an existential impossibility. Their commanders were chosen not for intelligence, but for the purity of their willingness to fight. They had never backed down from a confrontation in 40 centuries of existence. They charged 200 warships, weapons at full power, screaming across the border of human space on a trajectory that every tactical system available confirmed was suicidal, and whose commanders knew this, and charged anyway, because they were the Vorath, and the Vorath did not retreat. Commander Voss watched them come. She sat in her chair with her hands folded in her lap, and the lines around her eyes deepened slightly, and she was quiet for a long moment. "They know," her second officer said. "They understand what they're flying toward." "Yes," Voss said. "Then why?" "Because they built their entire civilization on the idea that there is nothing worth fearing." She paused. "And we're asking them to fear something. That's not a military problem. That's a philosophical one." She let out a slow breath. "And I don't have a gentle answer for it." She gave the order. The human warship did not accelerate toward the Vorath fleet. It did not need to. It simply adjusted its position, a small, precise movement that, on a ship of its scale, carried the force of geological processes, and activated a single system, one system among hundreds, a fraction of its capability. The choice was intentional. There was no bright flash, no dramatic energy discharge lighting up the dark. No sound, of course, there never is in space. Space folded. That is the only way to describe what the sensors recorded, and even that description fails the reality of it. The geometry of the region simply changed, collapsing inward in a way that violated the categories physics used to understand itself, and the Vorath fleet, 200 ships, 40,000 crew, for 1,000 years of history and identity, was gone. Not destroyed, not scattered, gone, as though they had been a sentence. And someone had simply deleted the sentence, and the paragraph continued without the gap. The sensors recorded everything. The data was shared unedited to every monitoring station in the galaxy within minutes. And this time, there was no denial, no debate, no searching for alternative explanations, only silence. And into that silence, Earth sent its final message. It arrived without ceremony, without music, without the theatrical gravity that other civilizations might have wrapped around a moment like this. Just words, in plain text, translated into every known language. We do not seek to rule the galaxy. We seek only to protect our future. Come to us in peace, and you'll find us fair, curious, open, and glad of the company. Come to us in force, and you will find us ready. We have always been ready. We simply preferred that you never needed to know it. The stars are large enough for all of us. We intend to keep it that way." The Galactic Council's vote was unanimous, which had never happened before in its recorded history on any subject. Human space was declared sovereign and inviolable. Trade agreements were renegotiated from scratch. This time with humans at the table in a chair that had previously been occupied by silence and assumption. Old empires quietly withdrew from contested zones they had held for generations, rediscovering sudden enthusiasm for borders they had previously found flexible. Earth was no longer a developing world. It had become something the galaxy had no existing category for, a civilization that possessed the capacity for total dominance and had chosen, deliberately and irrevocably, not to exercise it. That restraint was, in the end, more frightening than the warships. The galaxy understood force. It had always understood force. Force had a logic that could be mapped, predicted, and eventually countered. But a species that could destroy you and simply chose not to, that required a different kind of understanding entirely. It required something the galaxy's great empires had not had much practice with: trust. Back on Earth, Commander Voss stood at the window of her office as the sun set over the Pacific. The sky went through its colors slowly, the orange and pink of late afternoon bleeding into the deep, clear blue of early evening, and then the first stars appearing one by one. The way they always had, the way they would long after every person alive today was gone. The warships had returned to their positions in shadow, dark and patient, like promises kept quietly. They would not be needed again soon. Perhaps not ever. That was the point. She thought about the generations of engineers who had worked in those hollowed asteroids, in those ocean floor facilities, never seeing the outcome of what they were building. She thought about the children who had grown up inheriting blueprints from parents who had inherited blueprints from their own parents, carrying forward a project with no name toward a future they could only imagine. She thought about the Vorath and the choice they had made, and felt the particular grief that comes with doing necessary things that cannot be undone. Her second officer appeared in the doorway. "The Council's formal recognition came through," he said. "All 47 member civilizations. It's official." Voss nodded slowly, not taking her eye from the darkening sky. "How is everyone doing?" He considered the question. "Quietly," he said. "No one celebrating." "Good." She was still for a moment. "You know what's strange? Every species in that chamber spent centuries looking at us and thinking we were small, thinking we were limited. They saw what we let them see and decided they understood everything." She tilted her head slightly. "What they never noticed was that we were watching them just as carefully, learning everything we needed to know." And what did we learn? Voss finally turned from the window. In the fading light, she looked older and younger at the same time, a woman carrying the full weight of what had been done and the full clarity of why it had needed to be done. "That the galaxy is not cruel," she said. "It's just afraid. And afraid things act like bullies, until they're reminded that the universe is bigger than their fear." She picked up her coat from the chair. "Our job was never to conquer anyone. It was to show them that they don't have to be afraid of us, and that being afraid of provoking us is a very reasonable alternative." She walked toward the door and paused. "Make sure the warships are resupplied. Keep them dark. Keep them quiet." A small, tired smile crossed her face. "And send a message to the Council. Tell them we'd like to renegotiate the water allocation treaty for the outer colonies. We've been patient about that one for about 60 years, and I think this is probably a good week to bring it up." Her officer laughed. Actually laughed the first time in days, and the sound had followed her down the corridor and out into the evening air. Above her, the stars appeared one by one, indifferent and ancient and vast. And somewhere in the shadows between them, in the patient dark of deep space, the warships waited, as they always had, in silence, because that was the final truth. The lesson written across centuries of hidden work and quiet sacrifice, the answer to every empire that had ever looked at a small blue world and seen an opportunity. Humanity had never been weak. They had simply been waiting for the galaxy to be ready for the truth. No one in the galaxy was supposed to notice Earth. For centuries, human space had been the quiet corner of the cosmos, a modest civilization on a blue world, still stamped with the Galactic Council's most dismissive classification, developing. No massive armadas patrolled its borders. No strange energy signatures leaked from its systems. Just a small, curious species trading goods, forging diplomatic ties, and gazing at the stars with wide, wondering eyes. The galaxy paid humanity the same attention one might give a candle burning in an empty room, noting its presence only long enough to confirm it posed no threat. That was exactly what humanity had intended. The signal appeared without warning on a cold Tuesday morning, by Earth's reckoning, at Deep Monitoring Station Velar 9. Perched at the ragged edge of the Orion Arm, Senior Analyst Vorath of the Drenai Collective had been nursing his third cup of broth when the console screamed at him. He set the cup down slowly. The energy reading stretched across his screen, like something impossible trying to fit inside possible space. He stared at it the way a man stares at cracks spreading across a wall he was told would never break. Then he called his superior. Then his superior called hers. Within 20 minutes, 17 stations across 3 sectors had confirmed the same data, and the broth sat cold and forgotten. The mass reading defied calculation, larger than most moons. The energy output was not erratic or explosive. It was steady, controlled, and unmistakably artificial. That last part was what drained the color from every analyst's face. A natural phenomenon could be explained away. Something artificial meant someone had built it. "It must be a sensor cascade error," said one officer, her voice carrying the careful optimism of someone who desperately needed to be right. "Humans cannot construct something of this scale. It simply isn't possible." But the signal did not fade. It sharpened. It clarified. More stations locked on, their instruments triangulating a position just beyond Earth's orbital path. Nestled in the deep shadows where light forgot to reach, the object was not drifting. It was positioned with the deliberate precision of something placed rather than lost. Then the second signal appeared, identical in mass, identical in energy signature, identical in design. The silence that fell across the monitoring network was the kind that precedes not panic, but the slow, terrible process of understanding. The Galactic Council chamber erupted. 100 species argued across 100 channels simultaneously, holographic representatives flickering and gesturing, their voices layered into a cacophony that the translation system struggled to untangle. Some laughed, nervous, performative laughter, the kind that fills a room when no one wants to be the first to admit they're afraid. "Humans," one counselor from the Sheth Empire said, his mandibles clicking with amusement. "We're discussing humans? They're traitors, diplomats. They write poetry and argue about philosophy and occasionally discover something charming about their own biology. They do not build planet-scale megastructures." "And yet," said the Council's chief sensor officer, pulling the data onto the main display, "the readings do not lie." The amusement died. Every scan from every independent station pointed to the same conclusion. The objects were real. They were engineered. And the materials, the alloys, the energy cores, the gravitational fields rippling outward from their surfaces, bore the quiet fingerprints of human manufacturing. Not ancient ruins accidentally activated. Not borrowed technology. Not a bluff. Humanity had built them. The silence that replaced the laughter was far worse than panic. Panic, at least, is loud. Long before the first alert flashed across alien screens, the decision had already been made. It had been made in a room with no windows, deep beneath the Pacific Ocean, by 12 people who carried the weight of their species on their shoulders and showed none of it on their faces. They had studied history, not just human history, but galactic history, the long and brutal record of what happened to civilizations that grew too quickly in the open. Worlds that announced their strength too early became targets. Worlds that were too weak became colonies. And the galaxy, for all its philosophical councils and trade agreements, still ran on a currency older than language, power. So humanity had made a choice. Not loudly, not heroically, quietly, the way you make the most important decisions. In the dark, without applause, unsure if anyone would ever understand why. The project had no official name, not even a designation in the sealed archives. The people who knew of it called it simply the answer. And most humans, the billions who woke each morning and lived ordinary lives, who loved and argued and hoped, never knew it existed. The chosen few were engineers, physicists, commanders, and architects of the impossible. They worked in hollowed asteroids, in underwater facilities, in regions of deep space where even council sensors swam blind. They worked across generations. Children inherited their parents' blueprints. Grandchildren completed what their grandparents had only dreamed. Some died never seeing the end of what they were building, trusting that someone else would carry it forward. Their mandate was simple to state and terrifying to hold. Build something that will never need to be used. The warships they created defied every category the galaxy had invented for such things. Each one was the size of a small planet, with its own gravitational field, its own atmosphere, its own contained star burning at its core. Their hulls were woven from materials with no galactic classification, dark and smooth and patient, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. Their shield systems did not merely deflect energy. They bent space itself, curving the geometry of reality around them like water parting around stone.